Here there are academicians, scientists, students, private, and all of you. Today we have a special guest at University of Indonesia that will give us a lecture about our future for strengthening our food sovereignty. Dr. Pengabdian have introduced Dr. Vandana Shiva, so I will not take much time to reintroduce Dr. Vandana Shiva. So I give time to Dr. Vandana Shiva to give the lecture. Please. I want to very warmly thank the University, Kehati, Mandasa, who has done so much work in organizing this trip. She's been working at it for more than a year. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's such a pleasure also to have been able to arrive in time for your Independence Day, having departed from India after our Independence Day. Because at the end of it, the issue of our seed and our future is linked very intimately to our freedom. The beautiful music which opened today's event had two songs. Actually, all three songs were relevant to the theme. The first was about sharing, and that's what makes Indonesians happy. And you are so happy. My son, who's with me, Patrick, was saying, everyone is smiling. At the very high gross national happiness index. Because no one's grouchy. The second song was about who will farm our fields. It was in fact about the last farmer. And then the last song was about the last seed. How could we have reached a situation where farming, which is still the livelihood and vocation of the majority of the people of the world, and in our societies will be the only livelihood or no livelihood at all? How could we have reached a situation where we suddenly have to worry who will farm? And seed, which is the very embodiment of continuity, seed which holds both the past and the future, seed which is the connection between the collective intelligence of our ancestors and the collective intelligence of all the species who have worked together to pollinate that seed, the organisms in the soil that fertilized it, that gave us generation to generation to generation of seed. It might go latent, but it never died. It burst forth when the right conditions were there. During wars, agriculture would stop, but seeds would be saved, largely by the grandmothers. In a famine year or a drought year, there might be no cultivation. There's a very touching story about my region. I come from the central Himalaya where the Ganges starts. And there was a time where we were actually ruled by Nepal, the Gorkhas. And there was a war. People died, but not in a single hut have they touched the seed. The seed bins, and I'm sure even traditionally here in Indonesia, seed was kept in squash, in gourd containers. And all of them, they called it tomdinge, were full of seed. Because you don't destroy the seed, because the seed holds the future. If you eat up the seed and you destroy the last seed, you're basically closing the future. The story of the seed is the story that has shaped large part of my engagements in the last 30 years, beginning with 1984, when India's entire fabric was shaken up by a series of events, but the two most outstanding were the invasion of the Golden Temple, which is the sacred shrine of the Sikhs, by the Indian military, and then Indira Gandhi, our Prime Minister, was assassinated. But behind it was a lot of violence. Punjab, where the violence was happening, 30,000 people were killed, was the land of the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution, started in 65, 66 in India, was given a Nobel Peace Prize. Let's talk peace. But in the 80s, Punjab was not a land of peace. And by December that year, a pesticide plant in the city of Bhopal leaked. It was owned by Union Carbide then, and it's owned by Dow Chemicals today. It leaked and killed 3,000 people immediately because the leak took place in the middle of the night, on a cold winter night. And it was poor slums around that the people were most impacted. I feel so touched. It's the 30th year of the fire. It's the women who were the victims of the disaster who are still leading the struggle for justice. Hundreds of thousands of children are still being murdered. Till date, there has been no justice. So by the end of 1984, I'm thinking in my head, why do we do agriculture the way we do it? Why do we have to have Bhopals and Punjabs? Where did it all come from? Because I was training as a physicist, I was too busy with quantum theory. I had no idea what was happening with Indian agriculture. Though as a very young child, I had grown up with my mother who used to farm, but that was pre-Green Revolution period. By the time the Green Revolution was happening, I was at school, focusing on physics, wanting to go to university, to do my honors, do my PhD, totally focused like you would be on this campus, because you know what university education is like. They don't let you do it part-time. They want you to do it double-time. So I was doing consulting for the United Nations University on a major project called Conflict Over Resources. And I said to them, I said, something's going on here that I need to look at, because at the bottom of it I think there are conflicts over resources and conflicts over models of development. So I did a study and it was published as The Violence of the Green Revolution. And in the process I learned three things. The first was that the reason we have so much violence in agriculture is because the Green Revolution or industrial farming is based on tools and technologies that come from the war. They were designed to kill. The first set of inputs is chemical fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizers were pushed all over the world after the wars because explosive factories that used to make explosives could either be shut down or continue to make something, and that is fertilizer. So you might notice so often the bombs that are used in terrorist attacks are fertilizer bombs. In Afghanistan, in Oslo, in Oklahoma, in India, it's always fertilizer being retooled to make an explosive. The second set of chemicals that came into industrial agriculture were pesticides. A large number of pesticides were evolved from the nerve gases that were used to kill the Jews in the concentration camps. And then of course they got developed further to pesticides. Herbicides like Agent Orange that was sprayed in Vietnam was also a war chemical. Today, ingredients of Agent Orange, like 2,4-D, are being used as a weed killer all over. So it's not an accident that tools that were designed for warfare should create conditions of warfare on our land and in our societies and in our farm. And therefore I say neither Bhopal nor Punjab were accidents. It was built into the structure of that model. But the destruction has continued. We're just preparing a new report on what are the hidden costs that are not taken into account. In environmental sciences, these are called externalities. Externalities means costs not taken into account. Costs that society bears, costs that the environment bears, costs that the other species bear. I'm not going to burden you too long with this, but let me just give you a few indicators. So, use of pesticides, and this is just figures we've developed for India. Domestic animal poisoning, $191 million annually. Other animals, 6 million. Wild animal poisoning, 2.7 million. Bird poisoning. The Bird Society came to see me the other day from India, and they said, thank you for the work you're doing to promote organic farming, because birds are just dying, just dropping dead. Bird poisoning is 2.4 billion. Fish kills 36.4 million. Honeybee poisoning, 75% honeybees and pollinators have gone in large parts of the world, 75%. In India, the assessment is 349 million. The emergence of resistance in pests and the destruction of natural enemies, much as that costing 33 billion. Now, this form of agriculture has been called productive, efficient, scientific, based on technological progress, and each of those terms has actually been distorted. Let me begin with productivity. Productivity is a simple measure of output per unit input. That's all it means. So, productivity should take into account everything that is produced and all the inputs that go into the system. Now, a typical small farm of India or of Indonesia would have diversity of outputs. You've been having a feast with the delicious fruits you produce. No agricultural productivity assessment is fruit calculated, because only the globally traded commodities are counted. I have called it the monoculture of the mind, that can only see that which is traded globally, not that which is growing locally and being used locally. Fruits don't count, the soil organisms don't count, the pollinators don't count, the different foods produced don't count, the volunteer crops, because in good farming, half the production is plants that come on their own, that you don't have to plant, but you create the right habitat. All of the greens we use are very often volunteer spontaneous crops. And I would request you all to do a rapid study with participation of grandmothers of Indonesia before the plants and the knowledge is lost. Because these will be the seeds of the future. Of what are the diverse foods people eat or used to eat. Now, none of this is counted. So, the output is reduced to one part of one crop. Why do I say one part of one crop? Because, for example, what was the shift of the Green Revolution? The shift of the Green Revolution was not that we did not have rice and wheat before the Green Revolution, but the traditional varieties used to be tall varieties, except a few evolved by farmers. So the green revolution in rice began with an Indonesian rice variety called Dejanmu, something like that. But they took this short variety, crossed it, and then said, we've created the green revolution. Warlock is praised, but not the Indonesian farmers who gave that first plant. The wheat green revolution was based on a Japanese wheat variety called Norin. But both of them were basically to shorten the stem of the plant and make dwarf varieties, because the green revolution was based on spreading chemicals. Traditional varieties did not go well with chemicals, so they had to create the dwarf varieties to withstand higher doses of chemicals. And these then were spread as monocultures. The variety used for the green revolution in rice would have been one among 100,000 varieties that farmers of Indonesia had evolved. Indian farmers had evolved 200,000 rice varieties. And the Sanskrit name for rice is prana, life, breath. This food was about life, it's seen as being about life. So the straw disappeared. The straw goes to feed the soil and create organic matter. It goes to feed the animals. And about 15 years ago, when I started rice collections in Orissa, farmers were still using their traditional varieties. And I would ask them, I said, why are you using your old varieties? And they said the thatch of the short varieties doesn't stop the rain. Because, you know, the old varieties have very soft straw, and then you can make a really nice hut with that. Whereas the thick straws don't make a good roof. So it was for housing that they were using. They use this so many in the tribal areas where rice evolved. And I'm sure this is a culture shared in Indonesia. In those tribal areas, in Chhattisgarh, I was traveling when I started the rice collections. And the two very inspiring things I learned there was one, a festival called Akti, which relates to the first song that was sung, about sharing. And Akti, which is the first day of planting, all the farmers bring their rices and make an offering to the village deity. And then it's given back to everyone in a mixture to remind them that this is a common heritage. This is not private property. The other part of it was the women make beautiful designs with paddy and hang them on the door. So I just said, for which festival was this? And they said, not for a festival, it's for the birds when there's no grain in the field. See how deep the idea of sharing is. That food is not just for humans. After all, food is the web of life. We have a beautiful ancient Upanishad which says, everything is food, everything is something else's food. So true. We are the food of bacteria. We think we're the top of the pyramid. No, we are the bottom of the pyramid, because the bacteria have a feast on us after we go. Everything is food, everything is something else's food. And that's why everything we do in agriculture must be seen through the food web. Not the global supply chains of commodities. So the output is forgotten, except the one commodity that's going to travel in a container. Its nutrition is not counted, its taste doesn't matter, just the weight. How much does it weigh? And I've seen farmers of the Green Revolution run to sell their rice the day they harvest it, because there's so much water in it that if they hold it for 2 days, the weight will come down. In terms of input, and this to me is the most shocking element. In terms of input, we need to count everything that goes into a food system. In ecological agriculture or organic farming, which is based on internal inputs, you use your organic matter, you compost it, you recycle it, there's no external input. You have your own seed, you save it, you select it, you breed it, you plant it. You don't have to buy it from outside. You have biodiversity in your field. You don't have to by pesticides, because the biodiversity is controlling the pests. Everything is being provided from inside. So it is a zero-cost system. Zero external input system. The productivity is very high. How is the productivity of industrial agriculture made high? First, by not counting the inputs at all. If you count inputs in energy terms, and this has been done by so many studies, 10 units of inputs is required to produce 1 unit of output. 10 kilocalories produces 1 kilocalorie. It's a negative economy. Can't sustain itself. Part of those 9 kilocalories lost become the entropy, become the climate devastation. No production system could sustain itself if you use 10 times more as inputs than what you produce. That is only held up at the scientific level by manipulating the productivity assessment, and at the economic level by the $400 billion subsidies that keeps it afloat. The rich countries give $400 billion subsidies. India, just for nitrogen fertilizers, gives more than ₹1 trillion subsidy. Just for nitrogen fertilizer. So you don't count the costs of the inputs. What you count is labor as an input. Now that to me is the first destructive step. And it is not an ancient thinking, it's only a result of recent definition of the economy. That said, there's capital, there's labor, there's land. But capital is just another name for money. Money is not a creative agent, it's a means of exchange between people. The creative agency is nature and human beings. Both have been reduced to dead input. So a farmer works hard, but what they produce is not seen as being produced by them, it's being produced through the investment made by an investor. The land is not seen as being productive in of itself. It's a speculator who's seen as giving value. And I get fascinated with the term real estate. Because real estate means when land becomes unreal. Yeah? It starts to get defined in terms of who can speculate on its price more, whether it be agricultural land or urban land. I believe the seeds of our future are very deeply connected to the question raised in the second song. The song that said, where will the next farmer come from? Are farmers giving up farming because it's never been good? In which case farmers would have given up farming centuries ago. We wouldn't have had ancestors who did farming. We wouldn't have had generations 10 years ago, 20 years ago, who didn't just do farming, but enjoyed it, took pride in it. The reluctance of younger generations to farm comes from, first, the unjust treatment of farmers, where farmers are just not getting the return. What they grow, they're growing at very high cost. The industrial system is a high input system, which doesn't count the inputs in productivity. And farmers are transformed from being producers to consumers of chemicals and toxics and seeds. And as consumers, they're constantly having to borrow. I have watched, my mother, who chose to be a farmer, supported us, very well. And our father was a senior forest officer, and she made more money out of farming than he did out of a senior government job. But today, a farmer can't survive. Give you the case of cotton farmers, and we will request Hayu to make available this new film that Karthikeya and his team has just made on testimonies from the farmers of the region of Vidarbha where the suicides are highest. 300,000 farmers have committed suicide in India since 1995. 300,000. Now in this land, because this is the land where Gandhi started his ashram. So I've been going there. In fact, we started the organic movement in India in 1982 from that ashram. And when I used to travel in the villages around, no village had a monoculture of cotton. Never. You'd have cotton, you'd have jowar millet, sorghum millet, you'd have pigeon pea, you'd have 5 or 6 crops in the field. It's a drought-prone area. So the more diversity you have, the more it can sustain itself through the drought period. Because the soil is not exposed. It's when soils are exposed that in dry areas, the soil loses all its moisture. And that's when the soil drought kills the plants and you have a crop failure. As long as you have a cover crop, and mixtures create cover crops, biodiversity creates cover crops, you will always be able to retain the soil moisture, and this diversity of crops also maximizes the return to the soil. So you have more organic matter. When you have more organic matter, the soil holds more water. It acts like a sponge. The humus that is created by organic matter absorbs the water and holds it. You might have 1 inch of rain, but you can grow a crop. And if you don't have organic matter, you can get 40 inches of rain and you'll have a drought, because the soil holds nothing. This land of diversity converted now into not just cotton, but monoculture of GMO BT cotton. Nothing else. This is the land where 1,500 varieties of cotton evolved, including naturally colored cottons. All the colors in this room I have seen natural cotton as a child. Blues and greens and pinks and purples. Don't see any. So the BT cotton is a genetically modified cotton. Genetically modified crops are introduced for one reason alone: to take ownership on the seed through patenting. I was invited to a meeting in 1987, which is what led me to start the work on seeds, where the industry that used to produce the chemicals that killed people in Bhopal, that continue to kill people today, that industry was now saying, our future money will come from owning seed and collecting royalties. But we can't just go to a farmer and say, your seed is mine. We're going to do something to it, claim it as our invention. Genetic engineering became the route for them to claim they had invented the seed. Now, all that genetic engineering does is move a gene from one species into another species. Conventional breeding has always involved breeding within the same species. So humans have children who are humans, and humans breed with humans. Wheat breeds with wheat and gives rise to wheat. Of course, the offspring will be slightly varied. But Indonesian children will look Indonesian, and Indian children will look Indian, though each of them will be different slightly. That is the nature of life, that it is constantly modifying and bringing in change and bringing in adaptation. So what are the tools that are used to move genes across species boundaries? Genes of bacteria into plants, like the BT cotton, genes of cows into plants. There's a wheat research being done in England where cow genes have been put into plants, genes of human beings into animals. I stopped a piracy of an Indian cattle called Vechur, where they were doing genetic engineering with human genes. You might remember Dolly, the big experiment with Dolly. Well, that was genetic engineering with human beings, human genes. And the idea of that firm, which is now folded up, they've had to shut down, it was total failure. The idea was they're going to put human genes into the cow, and in the cow's milk, they will extract human proteins and sell it as human protein. debated, the owner and founder of that company called Protein Pharmaceuticals Limited, when the laws were being debated in the European Union and the European Parliament. And he said, these sheep are not living animals. Sheep are just furry little factories producing pharmaceuticals, just furry little factories. So the first issue of genetic engineering is, it's based on the idea of life as a machine made by human beings, rather than life as self-organized intelligence that is maintaining evolution and adaptation. The second thing about genetic engineering, as I said, is you move a gene, you claim ownership through creation. But moving a gene through shooting it with a gene gun or infecting it with a plant cancer, agrobacterium, is not the making of the plant. A very crude parallel would be, so many of you have come with your rucksacks into this hall. You've moved a rucksack here. The rucksack wasn't here before. Can you imagine if you tell the university president that I brought a rucksack, therefore I made this building, and I made the whole university, and now you must pay me rents. You bring a rucksack and you want to collect rents from the university. And maybe you want to go further and say not just rents from the university, but even the fees of the students should go to the one who moved the rucksack. And all that the corporations have done in genetic engineering is move the gene. And the gene movers are claiming to be creators of life. I often say, GMO means God move over. We are the creators. We will collect the rents. And then they don't stop at that. The reason they're saying that is to collect royalties from farmers. And worse, they impose such laws through influencing governments and international agencies. So the World Trade Organization laws on intellectual property, Article 27.3b of the Convention of the TRIPS Agreement, that article Monsanto says we wrote it. A representative said in 1995, after WTO was established, we are the patient, diagnostician, and physician all in one. We defined a problem. And for them, the problem they defined was farmers save seeds. He said, we offered a solution, now onwards it should be a crime for farmers to save seeds. And that's all that industry has done, from the 80s till now, try to criminalize farmer seed saving. When I heard in 87 this idea that they wanted to make it illegal for farmers to save seeds, I said, saving seeds and conserving biodiversity is our highest ecological duty as members of the earth community. How can our duty be criminalized? So I came back home and started Nandani, which means 9 seeds, which stands for diversity. As you know, after 9 there's 10, which is 1 and 0. So 9 is the highest you can reach. But I also, in evolving Nandani as a movement, took inspiration from Gandhi, both from a spinning wheel, because you might remember, Gandhi pulled out the charkha, the spinning wheel, during our freedom movement. And everyone laughed at him and said, how do you think a few pieces of wood can get you freedom? Because the idea then used to be you got to have arms to fight a violent colonization. And Gandhi said the reason the spinning wheel is powerful is because it can be in the hands of the last woman in the smallest part. And it's only when the last Indian is involved in the freedom movement will we be strong enough to drive the British out. The smallness of the spinning wheel was its power, because it could be in everyone's hand. So I took inspiration from that, and I said the seed is the spinning wheel of today. And it can be in the hands of everyone. The littlest child, the poorest farmer, the oldest woman can have that last seed protected for the future. There was another thing Gandhi taught us, and I feel it is such an important pillar of democracy. And he learns it himself through practice in South Africa. You might remember the apartheid regime of South Africa. 16 years before Mandela was born, Gandhi practiced non-cooperation against the apartheid regime, because they were requiring the wearing of identity badges on the basis of race. Blacks, Indians, whites. And Gandhi walked and said, we are all citizens who are equal. We will not be divided by race. And we refuse to have these identity badges. That was the first time he practiced satyagraha. It was 1906 and the date was 9/11. We call it the other 9/11. Because the 9/11 of New York created the violence around the world. It was violent in itself and triggered everything we see today. Gandhi's 9/11 started the fight against treating diversity as a problem. Treating diversity as a reason for oppression. When he came back to India, and in around 1916, he was asked to go to the area where the British used to force us to grow indigo, so that the textile mills could have the blue dye. Farmers couldn't grow food for themselves. Farmers would starve. It was little patch they were allowed for food. And Gandhi and his wives went to Champaran, this region in Bihar, and talked to farmers. And all the independence movement joined, and house-to-house surveys were done. And the farmers would say, we want to stop doing this because we are starving. It was a globally traded raw material. The people, the plantation owners were becoming millionaires, and the farmers were starving. At the end of it, Gandhi gave a call. It was 1970. It's called the Champaran Satyagraha. Satyagraha means the fight for truth. And the peasants came out and said, we would rather die, we will not grow indigo. And that's how the forced cultivation of indigo started. And then in 1930, and that's the problem with this colonizing capitalism and reductionist thought, that it wants to find every little place to make money. Now, in our tropical cultures and climates, we need a lot of salt because we sweat a lot. We make our own salt. We've got the ocean right there. Not difficult. You just evaporate the water, you've got salt. The British said, how much money we can make if we monopolize salt? And they passed a law that only the British could make salt. Gandhi, in 1930, walked to Dandi Beach in Gujarat, called the famous Dandi March. Walked to the beach, picked up the salt from the sea and said, nature gives it for free. We need it for our survival. We will continue to make salt. We will not obey our law. Because he had learned through his involvement in South Africa and later with the Indian independence movement, and he had said, as long as the superstition exists that unjust laws must be obeyed, so long will slavery exist. And a duty for freedom is to identify these brutal laws and have the courage to say, I will not obey. One woman, Rosa Parks, in the United States, sat down on a seat in a bus where blacks weren't allowed to sit. And she triggered the civil rights movement. Because that law was an unjust law of segregation and racism. Another form of apartheid. So from the beginning when I started Albania, we took a pledge. Very simple pledge. And I believe this should be a pledge for every human being on the planet today. And the pledge is this: we have received our biodiversity from nature and our ancestors. We owe it to future generations to pass it on in all its richness and integrity. Therefore, we will do everything we can to conserve it as well as everything we can, to not obey laws or practices that make this diversity disappear and make it the monopoly of some individuals or companies. So Satyagraha, Gandhi did salt Satyagraha, we do beat Satyagraha, force of truth of the seed. The force of the truth of the seed is diversity. The force of truth of the seed is reproduction, renewal and multiplication. The force of the truth of the seed is sharing. The seed doesn't say, give me royalty. The seed just gives in abundance. So we've written a law of the seed, instruction from the seed. Because all laws of the seed have come from the greed-driven, myopic mind of some people who think profits for 10 years is all that counts, forgetting that they are extinguishing life forever. And that last seed will not be there for the future. The intellectual property rights is one example. But intellectual property rights seed come in two forms: patenting and breeders' rights. The breeders' rights are based on uniformity. In a world of diversity, to impose uniformity is like imposing apartheid in South Africa. It is ecological apartheid. It's basically saying only this seed will exist and everything else must go. But the law of the seed is all seeds will coexist and evolve into the future. Just as all cultures must coexist. And I've written a lot and thought a lot about the fact that when we take this monoculture of the mind to the extreme in terms of imposing uniformity, we also impose uniformity in the way we think about human beings. And that is the root of intolerance. It's at the root of what we are seeing explode in Syria and Iraq, in Egypt, in Nigeria, in your land, in my land. Where just as in a biodiverse field, diverse species don't just tolerate each other, they give mutual support to each other. In diverse societies, diverse human beings can live in harmony with no problem at all. It's when the kind of imposition of uniformity that Green Revolution paradigm imposes on agriculture is imposed on society through political ideologies. That's when all the intolerance starts to grow. And the intolerance is through across every line of difference. The fact that there are men and women in society. The fact that societies have different religions. The fact that societies have different indigenous cultures. Just as farming had the possibility of dealing with diversity, our societies also cultivated diversity. Now, how did this monoculture imposition affect agriculture, affect food security? It's an issue that's never addressed. I get exhausted. 30 years ago I started the Green Revolution. Till today we are repeatedly trolled through propaganda. Green Revolution avoided famine in India. GMOs are going to feed the world. How can you feed people by growing less? Monocultures produce less than diversity. The only way they produce more is when you don't look at diversity. I'll give you an example of a typical farm in our mountain areas. It grows 9 units of food. And the 9 units of food are different crops. A bit of corn, a bit of beans, a bit of potato, a bit of oilseed. If corn is 4 units of the 9, and you increase corn through hybrid corn and pushing fertilizers and pumping in herb pesticides, and you move it from 4 you say you increase the yield. But you never tell the story that the production of that land came down from 9 units to 5 units. The lost 4, the disappeared 4 are never counted. And that's the blindness to diversity. That inability to see diversity, the inability to measure it, the inability to value it, the inability to protect it. So we've started to measure 2 things. The first is the nutrition per acre, not the yield per acre. Because the yield only measures the part of the crop that leaves the farm for international trading. We assess everything that grows through a biodiversity assessment. And then we convert it into nutrition per acre. And in terms of nutrition per acre, our data is showing that biodiverse intensive farming of the kind we promote through Navdanya could feed 2 Indias on the same amount of land that we are using today without land expansion. The world could feed 2 world populations. The industry keeps harping on, oh, we're going to be 9 billion. We're going to be 9 billion. That's why we need genetic engineering. Through protecting biodiversity, we could feed 14 billion. Not that we should become 14 billion, it doesn't make much sense. But there is no reason to panic, because conserving biodiversity increases nutrition per acre. The second thing we calculate is what does it cost the farmer? As I said, the productivity measurement is totally flawed. And they say, agriculture grew. Look how well your palm oil plantations are doing. But are the farmers and peasants and tribals of Indonesia doing well? No, because they're 2 different economies. Similarly, when the corporations do well by selling more chemicals, selling more fertilizers, selling more pesticides, selling more seeds, that is considered the agricultural economy. But that is actually the drain out of agriculture. It's what leaves the farming, not what comes to farming. That is why our peasants go poorer. That's why 300,000 farmers of India commit suicide. That is why every 3rd world country is in debt. The farmer's debt at the individual level and national debt is both connected to us being repeatedly told, this will help you grow. Yeah. Borrow. Have investments. Now, nobody is doing charity at World Bank and IMF or at Wall Street. These are not charitable institutions. If they bring money in, they want to pull 25% out. If you spend 25% more, are you going to be richer or poorer? If seed that was 0 cost, you now have to pay 8,000% more than the commercially sold seed. Will the farmer be richer or poorer? They'll be poorer. If the fertilizers comes from organic matter of the farm, and instead you to go and buy a urea sack, what makes you poorer? The urea sack. Yet we've always been made to believe, and farmers have started to believe, chemical agriculture will bring me more money. We sit with them and say, let's calculate. And of course, when they really calculate, the net income is always negative. But they don't look at the net income, because the net income is not an expenditure they make. They don't have money, so they can't spend. So they take it on credit. And since they're taking it on credit, they have no idea how the debt is piling up. Just as much as our leaders keep signing papers without thinking of how the debt is piling up. When the debt bubble will burst, you know, the Wall Street bubble was a speculation bubble. But the debt bubble is a very big bubble. I mean, all of the United States, every young person has a $20,000 debt the day they leave college. And that debt just grows and grows and grows. The credit card debt was more than the bank debt. The bailout that was done. Well, the bailout was smaller than the credit card debt of the United States. So we are being pushed into living in debt economies. And all this is being done in the name of providing food security, providing more nutrition. So what's the record of genetic engineering as a solution to hunger? Genetic engineering cannot produce more food. It's not in the nature of the technology. As I said, all you do is shoot a gene of a toxic from bacteria into the plant, add a viral promoter and add an antibiotic resistance markers. These are not yield improving technologies. The plant exists from before, either bred by farmers or bred by universities. All you've done is add a gene. The characteristics of yield come from the original breeding. Genetic engineering is not a breeding technology. That is why any time you're told it's faster and it's more precise as a breeding technology, that's the first false step scientifically. It's a genetic transformation technology, not a breeding technology of breeding a new generation of a plant. So the yields have not increased beyond what plant breeding would do. In the United States, there's a report called Failure to Breed. Not in a single case has the yield increased. The second very big argument is it's an alternative to chemical farming. I remember the ads for BT cotton, you'll never have to spray. In 2007, Indian farmers sprayed 13 times more. We had such a horrible pest attack. Even this year, they're spraying 5 times more. Pesticide use is going up. Herbicide-tolerant crops is the second family of crops. Glyphosate is just going through the use of Roundup and glyphosate is shooting through the roof. Now, I was very disturbed to hear that 80% of the soya that Indonesians are eating for their wonderful tempeh is being imported and is GMO soya. The problem with GMO soya is that it's not just the issue of the modifications in the soya through genetic engineering, but the fact that it is Roundup resistant soya, which means you have huge levels of residues of glyphosate and Roundup. Now let me just run through some evidence that is every day there's new evidence. A French scientist, Seralini, studied Roundup-ready corn, not soya, did corn. Organ failure and emergence of cancer in rats. He's the only one who did a 2-year study. 2 years of monitoring. It was published in one of the top journals of the world, the Journal for Food and Chemical Toxicology. Monsanto started to put pressure on the journal, say, retract it. This is their new trend. When a scientist publishes, but it goes against their propaganda, they say, get rid of this paper. The journal said, sorry, it is peer-reviewed. This has been peer-reviewed by scientists, we cannot retract it. Guess what they did? Appointed their own editor. Mr. Goodman was made editor who said, I'll retract it. Fortunately, Dr. Seralini persisted and he's got the paper published in another journal. He hasn't given up. But the first scientist who was troubled was Arpat Putsai. UK government asked him to study GMOs. He actually thought there'd be no problem. He was surprised to see the results. Brain shrank, pancreas expanded, intestine damaged. He talked to his director, he said, this is very serious. 3 months of feeding rats has done this. Can you imagine what will happen to human beings eating this over a lifetime? He and his director went to a BBC press conference. For 1 day, it was all over the world. Next day, Arpat Putsai was removed from his job and his lab was shut down. He was a Hungarian refugee. He's gone back to Hungary saying, I left the Soviet Union for freedom in England. I'm going back to Hungary for freedom. Because there's no freedom where corporations rule. The science, they rule they control government, they control media, they control research. That is the issue right now, sovereignty. Food sovereignty begins with the seed. But it is the sovereignty of our knowledge also. That's why it's related to institutions like the university. Will we work as slaves, multiplying falsehoods because it's very convenient, or will we serve the earth and our cultures to create freedom through knowledge, through really deep knowledge? Let me give you two examples of potential colonization that are already being cultivated in a very intense way. So I talked about the two applications of genetic engineering, which are Bt cotton and herbicide. Bt crops and herbicide tolerant crops. So it's Bt, HT, both are poison producing plants. They haven't delivered. They haven't increased food production. They haven't controlled pests and weeds. They've increased super pests, they've increased super weeds. In the US, half the acreage is overcome by super weeds. And they're now preparing to release, it's been approved 2 weeks ago, release crops that can tolerate Agent Orange. Dow, which was involved in the Bhopal disaster, has just had an approval of Agent Orange, 2,4-D resistant crops. So now they'll be spraying Agent Orange. While the two existing applications, which account for 99% planting in the world, haven't delivered on what they said they would, they're now trying to promote genetic engineering for nutrition. And the two big promises of genetically engineered biofortification through nutrition, one is something called golden rice. And we have no dearth of vitamin A rich biodiversity. The fact that there is deficiency is because we've used a green revolution model of farming to kill everything green that brought us the vitamin A. We've treated sources of nutrition as weeds to be killed. And we've sprayed herbicides and got rid of them. And then we're surprised that there is no vitamin A available. The solution is cultivate the biodiversity. Bring it back. If the erasure and extinction of diversity led to malnutrition, cultivate biodiversity. Have greens growing everywhere. Every school garden, have gardens in every school, every mosque, every temple, every church should have a garden. Every community should have gardens. When the sanctions led to a cut-off of supply of oil and fertilizer to Cuba, Cuba totally turned its agriculture around. Went for tractors to horse-driven plows. It went from chemical fertilizers to organic farming, and it turned its cities into farms. And I've been there twice. Any open space in a city has been converted into a vegetable farm. And the vegetables are available for free at the gate for the citizens of Havana. Just go pick up a vegetable. Scarcity is created by destroying the potential of the earth to provide for us, and destroying the potential of human beings to provide for themselves. So golden rice is a genetically engineered rice with a little yellow in it. It is hundreds of % less efficient in giving you vitamin A. But vitamin A also needs fats and oils for absorption. So if your diet doesn't have that balance, you won't be able to absorb it. In 2000 is the year they started the Golden Rice Promise. They're trying to push very hard on the rice-eating cultures of Asia. We are the largest rice-producing and rice-eating cultures. Rice is, after all, an Asian crop. So they started trials in Philippines, and the peasants uprooted it, because if there's one genetically engineered rice, it will contaminate all the other rices. The United States lost all its rice exports because of contamination through rice trials. So a lot of, the industry has a lot of ability to do public relations. And one of their recent public relations is 200 million children have died because golden rice is not available. And I always say millions have been deprived because biodiversity has been pushed to extinction. Bring biodiversity back. Grow nutrition. You can't engineer nutrition, you grow nutrition. The second crop, which was initiated last year, is genetically engineered banana. And it's interesting how the story changes. For India, they say they'll solve the iron deficiency problem. For Uganda, they say they'll solve the vitamin A problem. Why do they target Uganda and India? We are the biggest producers of banana. Biggest. Producers and eaters. So if they can genetically engineer banana, then they grab a very big market. Again, on the GM banana, for iron, we use turmeric in our food, it has 68 units. The GM banana will, 15 years down the line, maybe get 2 units compared to 68. And I'm sure, and this is a program the university can definitely take up. As I mentioned, the knowledge of the grandmothers in terms of the biodiversity with different nutrition. But programs of assessment, after all, in today's world, all you have to do is put material through a mass spectrometer, and you get everything that is in that. You get the zinc, you get the iron. Our solution through biodiversity is not just that there are different crops and plants that give us vitamin A and give us iron, but none of them produce only one nutrition. How foolish to think that a plant should only have vitamin A. Plants that have vitamin A have iron, have zinc, have magnesium, and new studies are showing that organic farming increases nutrition value by 60%. 60%. We are also getting more and more research that is showing that chemical agriculture, based just on nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium inputs, is so depleting the micronutrients and trace elements in the soil that the plants are deficient in nutrients and trace elements, and our bodies are deficient. So in every significant micronutrient and trace element, which the doctors never used to bother about, and agricultural scientists never bothered about, we are now finding that that malnutrition is very, very serious. Even obesity is a micronutrient deficiency because it disturbs the metabolism. Zinc is leading to zinc deficiency, huge depression. Magnesium deficiency leading to attention deficit disorder. There's a very famous chef in England who got the government to give him schools, and he started to feed organic. And the children who couldn't sit still and were restless and nasty and ugly and violent, after a few months they were paying attention. Because attention deficit is not a problem to be solved through violence. It's a problem to be solved through nutrition. And nutrition comes out of balance and health, and recognizing that there's a continuum between the health of the soil and our health, the health of biodiversity and our health. We will have to very rapidly create economics of biodiversity, agriculture of biodiversity, sociology of biodiversity. These will have to be disciplines that we evolve, inspired, as the director said, from local wisdom and local experience. Because the costs of not doing it are too high. I was giving you some data on the impact of an industrial system, but if we don't grow biodiversity, we've calculated every year we are losing $69 million worth of nutrition. And no matter how many medical programs you create, you'll never be able to cope. The groundwater contamination, 45 billion. Air pollution, 68 billion. Loss of organic matter to soil, 7 billion, which is related to climate change. Because 50% of all greenhouse gases are coming from an industrial farming model, chemical farming model. nitrogen oxide that comes from nitrogen fertilizers, methane and carbon dioxide. In addition, soils that are deficient in organic are also more vulnerable to failure when climate change happens. Biodiversity, in my view, is the single biggest adaptation system for climate change. Both because biodiverse systems have more resilience in and of themselves, and we notice this on our farm. Systems with diversity never fail. You can have a drought, you can have a flood. Intensity of cyclones is increasing. Cyclones bring salt water from the sea, just like the tsunami of 2004 did. We've been saving seeds of salt-tolerant, flood-tolerant, drought-tolerant crops in the seed banks for the communities that Vandana has helped create. So when the Orissa supercyclone happened in 1999, our salt-tolerant seeds could help agriculture recover. In 2004, 2 truckloads of seeds were sent to Tamil Nadu from the Orissa farmers. But I must tell you, actually, a scientist brought those salt-tolerant seeds from Orissa to Indonesia. And I will dig up and send you the details. And they produced even more in Indonesia under salt conditions than in India. The productivity increased. These are innovations that are constantly happening through biodiversity. Nature is innovating, farmers are innovating. To make sure that we don't have an extinction of farmers with the last farmer disappearing, and we don't have an extinction of seed with the last seed disappearing. We need to shift from the monoculture of the mind to a biodiversity of the mind. We need to start recognizing how rich we are as cultures. I think some of the farmers of Indonesia should be taken to the Midwest of the United States with miles and miles and miles of GM corn and GM soya. No small farmers left. 60% of the farms are renting the land from speculators on Wall Street. The land has moved into the hands of Wall Street. So if we have to protect our future, we have to protect our land, we have to protect our farmers, we have to protect our seed. And in our own seeds are the seeds of our freedom. Our seeds are not primitive, just as much as our languages are not primitive. English is just one language. It cannot be made the measure of other languages. The same goes for clothing. You all look so beautiful in your batiks. Can you imagine if black was made compulsory? Boring black shirts instead of all the wonderful batik you wear. Well, biodiversity is the same. Methods of farming are the same. Imposing the wrong measure of a toxic monoculture on abundant, free, and mutually enhancing biodiversity is a recipe for hunger and poverty and ecological instability. On the other hand, keeping our seeds in our hands for food sovereignty is the path for prosperity, is the path for ecological sustainability, and I really believe it's also the most significant path for peace in our times. Thank you.
I hope you can pick up my idea. And first of all, I do appreciate your coming here, and I feel very sad to be educated in the Western country. As I understand your point, it seems to me whatever we do.
Please mention your name, Baba.
Oh, sorry, I mentioned. My name is Tanggal from IDB, Pertanian Bogor, but I came here not as representative of IDB. You can keep it in mind. I come here as myself. Okay. Yes, I repeat again. I appreciate your coming here. Thanks very much. You opened my eyes and my feeling and so on. But I see the other side of your point. You strongly, seems to me, the other side of the scientific approach to human problem, especially in food context. It seems to me, if I'm, please correct me if I mistake. I do mistaken. And the scientific approach for you looks to be, according to your argument, it's not really useful. But disguise people, majority of people like that. But this is quite interesting in my opinion. Why should many people need to do go to university for education and use scientific approach to solve the problem? This is quite a very strong point that you make in my opinion. And the second, as a scientific, I'm interested in your evidence. You make a strong comment again about productivity of the high technology-based shift or something like that. You mentioned that this is the evidence or something like that. But I don't see your reference. This is very important for us as a scientist. We have to scrutinize the evidence. Just is the evidence scientifically proved or not, something like this. This is a matter of objectivity. This is, if you are right, we will support you. Trust me. That's why I thought before coming here, I will read your paper so I can scrutinize your idea and make the argument. But this is like monologue. You present your idea without having equal opportunity or good opportunity for us to scrutinize your idea. You don't present your evidence in scientific manners. I think it's not good. And the third one, you can later make a comment to respond to my comment. And the third one, the second one, we believe in about division of labor. Three of component of our development. Division of labor, specialization. And the second, private property right and market. That's the one things that we live as economy that bring our prosperity. That's why Marx's theory of population growth vis-a-vis the food production is not become evident. I suggest to you, just let first thinking your argument in that way and see why that argument we have to see in more broader context in this perspective. We are not living alone as a more community, but if we are coming, we live together with the world, with different, as you mentioned, diversity of culture, attitude, or something like that. When we interact with others, we have to satisfy what's people that involved in the market economy and other activities. So if India wants to have a chip good from Indonesia on the other side would want higher price for the good that you send to India. There is a, you see, different perspective. But when we deal together and to come to make a business, we have to compromise. It's not like extreme as you mentioned here. I mean, this they want, in my opinion. We have to come to compromise. It's not your point, it's not my point, but our point, we have to come together. That's also, in my opinion, applies to any technology and also production, any activities in economy, in my opinion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Question answers is an evidence that this is not a monologue, that you have I totally agree with you that the issue is not just the corporation, but the corporations are changing the nature of the state. After all, when that 175,000 bribe is given for BT cotton in Indonesia, it is given by a company to the corrupt officials. And what I see happening is worldwide, not just in India, and not just in Indonesia, US, everywhere, is the emergence of what I would call a new entity, hybrid entity, like you have hybrid seeds. We have a hybrid entity which I would call the corporate state, where the two are not separate from each other. We don't have to treat them as separate, they're one. Now, in the last I've been working for the protection of the earth for 40 years, I've been working for ecological agriculture for 30 years, for seed saving for 30 years. And till very recently, every time we raised an issue, it was possible for us to participate in writing the laws in it. And I'll give you examples. I was engaged in the movement called Chipko, where women came out to hug the trees. In 1981, we called for a logging ban and got a ban on logging, realizing that the biodiversity of forests in the mountains are not just timber mines. They are the protectors of soil and water and air. Today, the top ecological literature is showing the ecological functions. The women understood it from their common sense. They didn't have to have references and footnotes, because their footnote and reference was the reality of their experience, which is one of the issues that was raised by the third questioner. And I've been an academic, and I too used to believe that all you have to do is refer to another academic's publication, and that's knowledge. 40 years later, I'm much wiser. Knowledge is in the minds of the tribal, the woman, the grandma. And still we realize that that knowledge is what's going to show us the way to the future. And we get out of this closed circuit of educated people speaking to themselves in ignorance. Sadly, when you look at the ecological survival issue of the human species today, and you look at the expertise in published papers, it's too tiny to show us the future. We need a biodiversity of knowledge, and we need a biodiversity of evidence. The ultimate evidence is what happens in reality, not what happens in a footnote. We managed a logging ban because I got involved in seed saving and the issue of intellectual property. You know, WTO was being negotiated in the 90s. I got to know about this in 87. So I had to talk to our government and address our parliament. And I was asked to help in certain laws. We worked very closely with a multi-party parliamentary forum. We created a multi-party forum. So no party could say this is that party's agenda. And when we were forced by WTO to change our patent laws, we made sure we put rigorous definitions into it. So a patent is granted for an invention. Like I said, seed is not invented. Changing the formulation of a drug from 30%, 70% to 35%, 65% is not an invention. It's a trivial change. So our patent law has two very strict safeguards. Article 3A, it says trivial modifications will not be counted as inventions. And 3J, which has come out of the work we've done, which says biological processes are not inventions. Because life makes itself. Biology makes itself. Biology is not engineered. Now, I've had 30 years of debates with lawmakers, congressmen, industry of the United States, who are stuck with one point. Starting from 1980, when the first patent, or maybe it was 1970, the first patent on life was granted for a genetically engineered organism. And we are sort of sitting in a contest of two worldviews. One is a mechanical worldview, in which there is an attempt to redefine all of life as a manufacture. And the idea of patenting life comes from life as manufactured, which is so totally wrong, even from scientific measurement. And the other is, science itself is telling us, and all ancient cultures tell us, that life is self-organized complexity in relationship. That's what the new biology, new evolution is teaching us. So we managed to put protections. I was asked to help draft the Plant Variety Protection Act. Now I know you have such an act, and I've just read one little reference to it, and I want to read the full. But I could not believe the language of your Plant Variety Act and your Breeders' Right Act. It talks of superior seeds. There's nothing like a superior seed. Their seeds evolve for particular functions. A chemically adapted seed is not superior for organic farming, it's superior for chemical agriculture. Organic seed is superior for organic farming. In climate change, open pollinated seed that can adapt all the time is superior. We call it evolutionary breeding, a whole new scientific discipline in breeding. If we are having rapid climate change, then the seeds must be able to adapt, as cultures must be able to adapt. The potential for adaptation is the superiority. So there are different indicators. We say it's superior seed is biodiverse, its quality, it has taste and quality. How can a seed be superior if it has no taste? You know, I sometimes say that what they're doing is breeding rocks, because so far breeding used to be the mango in your back garden, or the plantain, or the watermelon. And now the breeding is for two purposes. To sell the seed every year, that is why your seedless melon, as well as to put it on a container ship to travel for 6 months. So what do you do when something has to sit for 6 months? You don't breed fruit, you breed rocks. You can't bite into fruit anymore, it has no juice. And a peach, and a pear, and a plum, and an apple all taste the same in the West. They taste the same. Whereas every variety of mango, every variety of banana tastes different in our lands. And that's the issue of diversity. So we managed to not only draft this plant variety protection respecting development, but I was able to put in a clause on farmers' rights. That the farmers are the first breeders. Their rights come first. Every other breeder, every other company uses a farmer's variety. And that's why the farmer's varieties must be the first ones. There's even now international laws like access and benefit sharing. Within that, I insist, access and benefit sharing means that there can be no intellectual property rights to something you've taken from someone else. There need to be sharing rights, there need to be obligations, there need to be responsibility, but not appropriation as if the farmer had contributed nothing, it's just raw material. And this is what has led to the phenomena of biopiracy. I give the details of the laws we've been involved with. This very important law I was part of in India called the Forest Dwellers and Tribal Rights Recognition Act. Because all cultures ignored indigenous cultures. And didn't give them the respect they deserved. We now have a Tribal Rights Recognition Act and a very famous case of bauxite mine being stopped by the tribals on the basis of this, the recognition of their rights. They said, but we don't want it. And every village had a hearing. They said, we don't want it. One of the most powerful companies, aluminium company, could not manage. And I think that's something Indonesia needs also. An indigenous diversity law for celebrating and recognizing all that diversity, rather than, from what I hear, all the violence indigenous communities are facing because they're on the land that someone wants, they're sitting on the minerals that someone else wants, and this resource grab and land grab that is so intrinsic to the current organizing of the economy is literally a war against the earth and indigenous cultures, and we have to organize. Now, I don't want you to think that everything's hunky-dory in India. The last 2-3 decades was different. Today, not only have we all got a corporate state corporations would like the corporate state to become a corporate militarized state. When you look at the Snowden leaks, why does the government have to do surveillance? It was all for economic affairs. Yeah? Politics, economics have all become about economy. GMOs are part of foreign policy. They're now part of geopolitics. And if you, I don't know how many of you have kept track. China has stopped GMOs for its army feed because they're realizing there are health impacts and they don't want their military to be sick. They don't mind that the citizens are sick, but the military should be sick. Russia has banned GMOs. And now they've stopped imports of every kind. Most of East Europe is GMO free. Most of Europe is GMO free. There are entire areas where the simple issue of the GMO is defining politics in a very serious way. So, is it hopeless? I don't think it is. I think we have to be more innovative. We have to be more creative. You know, in India right now we have a very, very important Supreme Court case on GMOs, where the top scientists of the country have asked for a 10-year moratorium. The top scientists on government labs have said we're going to study this stuff for 10 years before we approve it for commercial or for cultivation of trials. There's an attempt, very serious attempt, to silence that report. The leading genetic engineering lab, the leading toxicology lab, the leading nutrition lab, they put out this report and said to the Supreme Court, hold on, 10 years moratorium. Of course, Monsanto is very troubled, so once in a while, they bribe a minister, they bribe the Prime Minister's office, and say, approve trials. Trials get approved, we fight back. Then they're rejected again. Then the next government comes, the same thing happens. It's happening right now in India, right now. So this issue, I think it's time to stop thinking, each of us, we feel our governments are the worst in the world. Let's recognize most governments are right now playing second fiddle to corporations. And will become more violent if we do not become more active for peaceful means. The only antidote to a corporate militarized state is citizens who are aware, citizens who are engaged and active, and citizens who demand change so that they can't be individually isolated. The issue of farmers, yes, of course the farmers have internalized this model. And even while they get into deeper debt, they're kind of stuck in that vicious cycle. That is why I really do feel that that whole division of labor issue that was raised, that it's inevitable. On food, we can't have division of labor. Food is everyone's business. And we have to move into a food revolution where the tiniest of children also becomes a farmer by being a gardener. We've got to break the division between the garden and the farm. All good farming must look like a garden. All bad farming looks like a war zone. That we have started in India through Navdanya Gardens of Hope. Both with the widows of the farmers who committed suicide as well as with young children. Children must learn respect for the soil, respect for the seed, respect for farming. And when middle class and elite children are working on gardens in schools, the governments will start respecting the farmers too. Because working with the earth and serving the earth and creating and co-creating and co-producing with the earth and the biodiversity and the sea are the most creative acts. They have been treated as the most trivial actions, as if they don't produce. And that's the economics of the GDP. But the economics of life is they are the most important contributions. So everyone must become a farmer. And that's the only way young farmers will want to be farmers. It's happened with Navdanya. So many young people have gone back to their villages. Because once they see, they realize there's a difference. And more importantly, not only should everyone be a farmer by being a gardener, connected to the food system. It would be wrong to imagine a farmer will cultivate biodiversity if consumers are going to eat bad food in the supermarket. Consumers also have a duty to themselves and the earth and the farmer. And what we've done, and I noticed that's exactly what's happening here, outside the lobby is just so full of diverse food. Someone's making an effort for people to eat diversity. Because only when we eat diversity will we grow diversity. And when we eat diversity, we start to create another economic system. Because that centralized system based on monopoly and monocultures is failing to bring us food. 30% is all that industrial farms produce. We're made to believe we're being fed by the large-scale industrial farms. 70% food eaten by people comes from small farms and biodiverse farms. And this 70% could easily become 100% with urban gardens, with helping our farmers get their full fair share of the consumer rupee or rupiah. Whereas the 30% is destroying 75% of the planet already. If that 30% goes to 45%, the whole planet is over. The planet is a dead planet. There is no food, no life, no society on a dead planet. Not even a corporation. So that agenda of expanding industrial agriculture is a failed agenda ecologically, and it's a failed agenda nutritionally. Does not deliver. And the people, like I said, the people who are eating some of it are eating empty food, nutritionally empty food, tasteless food, toxic food. So even that is not fulfilling the criteria of what is food and nourishment. The food should nourish our bodies, make us healthy. Today food has become the biggest source of ill health. Just like 75% of the planet's ill health is related to industrial farming, 75% of people's ill health, hunger, malnutrition, is related to industrial agriculture. So it's failing ecologically, it's failing health-wise. The watermelon issue of the seedless melon, it's basically who would want to create seedless things? Only those who would like farmers to buy seed every year. There are two means by which farmers' rights and duties to save seeds are disrupted, and the cycle of seed going to seed is disrupted. The first is legal, like intellectual property patents, where farmers saving seed is treated as a crime by law. The other is biological. You make non-renewable seed. It could be hybrid, which doesn't breed true. It could be terminator, which we haven't allowed so far. Or it could just be seedless melon and seedless fruits. What we've done for this is come back to that seed-to-table connection. We've saved some of the old pulses varieties. They have so much more taste, and so much more quality, and they cook much better. People are willing to pay more. Central India has some old wheat varieties. And I was there for a farmers' meeting, and I just said, farmers should save their old seeds and grow their old seeds. 2 years later, I get a call from a farmer who was in that hall. He said, we started to use our seeds, old native seeds. We now have 2,000 farmers growing these native seeds. We are selling the wheat at 2 times the price because it has so much more taste and nutrition. And we are eating half because it has taste and nutrition. We only need 2 chapatis rather than 4. So the economy has increased 4-fold. That is the kind of thing we'll have to do with the melon with the seeds, which is the parent of the seedless melon. We need to create biodiversity communities, and we need to link the biodiversity communities to consumers who realize this is a better melon and realize it is free of toxics. And every time, I think people should stop saying healthy food is costly, because good food is the real price. Bad food is subsidized, but it is not subsidized enough to take care of your health. The next report we are going to do is on health issues. But we know, cancer is taking this much, obesity is taking this much. If we added those figures and you realize a farmer who took care of an old seed, brought you good organic food, fed you diversity, is not just a producer of good food, that farmer is your physician. Now, to your physician you don't question, you go pay 100,000 rupiah like that. Just a little more, 10% and 20% more is enough to change the market. Which brings me to the last one. I could take forever to reply to that last comment. It wasn't a question. I'm not going to take too long, but I will make some key points. I did not talk about science versus humanity. I talked about an old reductionist mechanistic science versus the new ecological science. I've done my PhD on the foundations of quantum theory. The topic of my thesis was hidden variables and non-locality in quantum theory. Mechanical physics, which is 100 years too old, says everything is immutable, everything is separate, everything is deterministic. Quantum theory says there's nothing immutable, particles become waves, there's indeterminism, and everything is non-separable. That's the new science. So, what? Well, I'm coming to that if you let me come to it. Biology which was far more interrelational, has moved back to copy a physics that physics gave up 100 years ago. It is now becoming mechanistic biology, and genetic engineering is the ultimate expression. That here are these fixed genes, I can take it like a Lego set, move it from here to there, nothing will happen except that little piece will behave itself. Lots of things happen. There's epigenetics. Please go and read publications on epigenetics. The environment affects the genes. In genetic engineering, the environment does not affect the gene because the gene is immutable. It cannot be affected. The new science of agriculture that is being recognized by every United Nations agency beyond the mechanistic science of chemical farming is the science of agroecology. Understanding the ecology of agricultural systems with their diversity and their diverse functions. That's where intelligence of humanity is moving. That's where the United Nations, UNEP, UNDP, FAO, the International Assessment of Science, Technology and Development, Agriculture, Science, Technology for Development, please read the report of IAASTD. 400 scientists working for 4 years, commissioned by every UN agency of the world, collectively at the Johannesburg Summit in 2002. They've read every paper of agriculture. You want references? Go read the references there. Chemical farming, green revolution, genetic engineering do not produce more. The only place where there's potential to increase food security is in traditional agriculture combined with the new sciences of agroecology. You cited 3 principles as sacred of life. Division of labor. Show me one mother who can bring up a child with division of labor. Every mother is a multi-diverse, multifunctional, diverse human. You talk about private property. Privare is derived from deprivation. It was created during the enclosures of the commons in the United Kingdom. Seed is a commons. Water is a commons. The atmosphere, the air we breathe is a commons. You are clinging to an outmoded dinosaur thinking. You need to move on. You realize commons is the future. That first song on sharing what makes Indonesia special, that we can share. That is the commons. And finally, you talked about markets. Well, there's a market with a capital M, which is Monsanto, Cargill, Unilever, etc. There's markets with small n. Those are the biodiversities of markets. We need more biodiverse local markets. That is where biodiversity will thrive. That is where employment will be created. That is where peace will be cultivated. And that is where happiness will grow. The global market, those Wall Street persons who think financial indicators and digital movement of how much, $3 trillion a day, go see how unhappy they are. They make a lot of money, but then they jump off 8 floors and commit suicide.
Thank you, Dr. Vandana Shiva. We have a little bit time for next question, maybe from the left side first, Ibu Bahagiawati, and then in the center, Ibu Nova, and then the
Vandana Shiva, kan mother language-nya English, but I'm not mother language, not English in Indonesia, so I let the organizer interpret it for her. Do you mind me after that? No? Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And welcome to Indonesia, Dr. Shiva. And saya mau mulai pakai bahasa Indonesia sekarang. Jadi, saya sangat agree sama Dr. Shiva itu bahwa diversity itu penting bagi kita, penting. Dan sampai sekarang Indonesia juga melakukan itu bagi tempat yang monokultur, bagi tempat yang bisa diversity, kita diversity. Perkenalkanlah saya bahwa saya namanya Bahagiawati yang disalah-salahi oleh Dr. Shiva tadi. Saya bekerja untuk memberi makan Anda semua, yaitu di Departemen Pertanian. Ya. Jadi sekarang sangat setuju sekali, monokultur tidak bagus, diversity atau multikultur itu bagus. Tetapi ingat, orang Indonesia ini beranak terus. Ya, BKKN itu sedang reformasi itu gagal. Terutama yang di remote area itu anaknya makin banyak. Jadi, alhamdulillah, coba bayangkan kalau tidak dengan Green Revolution kemarin, pada tahun 1970 saya baru bekerja waktu itu. Tahun 78 itu jumlah penduduk kita masih sedikit. Sekarang sudah banyak. Bapak-bapak, ibu-ibu kan sudah tahu kalau kita lewat itu bukan main, macet sana, macet sini. Itu tandanya orang kita sudah makin banyak. Bagaimana kita memberi makan mereka?
Ibu ya mohon untuk lebih selesai
begitu. Ya, jadi dengan Green Revolution itu kita sudah swasembada 1984. Walaupun sampai saat ini ya, sekarang saya ajak bapak-bapak dan ibu-ibu membayangkan jika yang dibilang Ibu Shiva tadi, kita jadi petani. Apakah bapak dan ibu semua pulang kantor ini mau bertani? Kalau begitu, nanti kita tidak usah ada petani lagi, karena kita masing-masing bertani. Nah, ya satu, pulang kantor. Bahwa pertanian itu adalah tidak mudah. Saya saja menanam bayam itu tidak seperti petani nanam bayam, dan saya tetap kepasangannya di bayam. Nah, sekarang coba buktikan bahwa ibu-ibu dan bapak-bapak pulang nanti nanam bayam. Mudah-mudahan berhasil. Nomor 2, saya ingin menanyakan, ada 20 negara di dunia ini
Ibu
yang menanam
pertanyaannya ke Ibu
ya,
coba
yang menanam tanaman GM crop. Ya, itu termasuk negara-negara yang sepak bolanya hebat, Brazil, Argentina, dan segala macam.
So your question is
Coba terangkan, bagaimana ada 20 negara lain yang Amerika, Kanada, Australia, negara ibu juga yang pendapatan petaninya meningkat, itu sudah ada datanya. Saya bisa memberi data itu. Cina yang handphonenya dipakai itu menanam tanaman GMO sudah 15 tahun, dan kita sendiri memakan itu GMO melalui kedelai yang dibuat tahu dan tempe sudah 10 tahun lebih. Itu tidak ada efek kansernya, itu tidak dilihat, tidak ada. Nah, waktu kita mau berhentikan kedelai itu malah petaninya malah komplain. Sekarang Indonesia memang tidak perfect.
Mungkin I really love to hear Dr. Shiva. I know you are an author of inspiring book Ecofeminism. So I really like to hear how ecofeminism support biodiversity. That's it. Thank you very much.
Everybody, thank you, Dr. Shiva, for coming out to Indonesia. I just want to say it's a great privilege to come out here because I went to school at the University of California at Berkeley, and basically since I was at that school, one of my professors said, you need to come check out Dr. Shiva, and I could not get a chance to see you because all the opportunities were all sold out. So for some reason while I was here in Indonesia, my boss told me, hey, you need to come out and Dr. Shiva's here. I was like, okay, so I came out from where I came from, 7,000 miles just to come here to see you. So my question is actually from Leaf Plus in Jakarta. Basically, just recently Indonesia is coming at a fork in its development at the moment. Jokowi Widodo just got elected, and he promised that he is going to somehow reduce import goods and support local farmers. And understanding that you discussed about shifting economies to local economies to support local farmers, I just want to know, what is your take on how Indonesia can prevent the repercussions from world interests, such as from multilateral organizations like World Bank, WTO, and corporate interests who might be saying, hey, we have interest in Indonesia, why are you coming to the conclusion to support local farmers? How can you what do you think about how Indonesia can move on and prevent any real impact that can cause a geopolitical situation? Thank you.
Thank you. And fourth question.
Informative, talk. I'm Helga. Me and my friends actually just opened an organic. Sorry? Helga. Me and my friends actually just opened an organic restaurant. So for us, it's it's a very more an interesting topic to hear from you. My question is that we have the situation that the government and most people working in the farm industry are mostly dominated by, let's say, older generation, which who usually prefer to stick to old paradigms, and the ones that are more receptive to new, non-mainstream information is actually the young generation. We're talking about people 20 years old who are about to, get into the job market. In your opinion, what's the first step that is most effective and impactful we should do to participate in biodiverse organic farming, and taking into consideration that we live in a very happy city, Jakarta, and most people say that they don't have time. And from your point of view, I'm just wondering, if you would have to choose between eating conventional local grown compared to imported organic produces, which one is more sustainable, or which one is better for the environment? Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this Dr. Vandana Shiva is your answer.
I think for the first question, the audience participated in a response in a very active way. So I don't think I have to go into it. On the issue of ecofeminism and its, what light it throws on these discussions, I think there are two key places where the bad food system, which is non-sustainable, which is uprooting farmers from the land, both mentally where they're culturally unable to think of farming as a future, but also financially and economically by making it unviable. And then creating conflict at every level. That bad farming system, besides the fact that it is hugely subsidized, is based on two very big false assumptions of capitalist patriarchy. The first is what I call the production boundary. Yeah? You arbitrarily decide where production takes place and where it doesn't take place. Yeah? So no production takes place on a small farm. Women don't produce. Women don't work. And nature, of course, is dead matter, so how on earth would it have intelligence and productive capacity? So you declare the soil as dead, you declare the seed as just raw material for someone to appropriate and turn into a seedless watermelon. You appropriate the resources and don't regenerate them at all. That production boundary is what has given us GDP. GDP only measures that which is commodified. If you produce what you consume, you don't produce is the definition of measuring GDP. So if I have a lovely garden and I have all the fruits in the world and I eat healthy, I don't produce. If I have lots of vegetables and I have lots of knowledge, they don't exist. It has to be traded. And now with the global trade, it's only globally traded commodities, which is why we dropped from 8,500 plant species that we used to eat across the world to 8 globally traded commodities. 8 commodities is not food. Commodities are not food. They don't feed us. They're traded. They go to make biofuel. They go to make animal feed. Most of the grain being grown in the world today is going for biofuel and animal feed when it's done industrially, under corporate control. That's why real food has to be reclaimed. Now the production boundary is the reason for destruction of biodiversity, but also the discounting of women's work and peasant work. And that needs to be counted. Ecofeminism says, just do your sums right. Count what needs to be counted. Count the contribution of fertile soil. Count the contribution of biodiversity and its ecological functions. Count the productivity of biodiverse systems. Count the health and nutrition that healthy food gives you. Just count the right way. When kids can't do their sums right, they fail in class. And here we have an entire paradigm based on bad arithmetic. And it's allowed to ruin the world and destroy the planet. And I have. The second very big false assumption is what I have called the creation boundary. Just like all the production, 90% of the production of the planet is said to not exist because it's not in that one market of the big M with the commodity trading. The creation boundary says that till a global corporation comes into the picture, there is no knowledge. So when universities do research in the public domain, it's not creative, it's not innovation. Might be innovative, but it doesn't count as innovation, not creative. All of those seeds that the farmers have bred, there's no creativity in it. When a company takes the seed, sometimes adds a gene, and sometimes just takes the seed. Then they say we created the seed, we have a patent. I have fought 3 cases of this kind of biopiracy. Very famous case of the neem, which is a natural pest control agent. I think you have the neem also in Indonesia. They patented the neem for pest control. We fought the case for 11 years. The US Department of Agriculture and the US and the WRS had the patent jointly. And we won after 11 years of fighting. We have the basmati in my valley. a company from Texas has patented that of that case and have that patentable. Monsanto patented an all Indian wheat. And that had to be given up. But when you talked about the melon, the original material comes from indigenous melon. That's piracy too. Because they take the melon, do some breeding, then take a property right on what they bred, but do not recognize the contribution of the farmer. Again, all that ecofeminism does is recognize intelligence and creativity wherever it is. The cell in my body renewing itself is acting creatively. The body as a whole renewing itself is acting creatively. That insect which develops resistance to a pesticide has intelligence, that's why it's able to develop resistance. Nature has intelligence, women have intelligence, children have intelligence, all people have intelligence. It's just that they have different kinds of intelligence. And like we can't use one yardstick of uniformity in agriculture, we can't use one yardstick of narrow intelligence to kill all of the intelligence of the planet and people. It's a very good new work on neurosciences being done. And the gentleman who wanted references, I can give you books with 50,000 references. So you realize that the mind that thinks in mechanistic reductionist ways is a very partial mind. The full mind is the right brain and the left brain. The right brain organizes in interrelation. It tells you what's the content. It tells you how things are related. The left brain breaks things down. But when the left brain becomes the master and starts disobeying the signals from the right brain, that's when you get dysfunctional societies. And you get ignorance parading as intelligence. That's the crisis we are in, and the crisis that we have to go beyond. The issue of that the young student from Berkeley raised about the future, I talked about the fragmentation and the left brain. Right? Now, all of domination takes place by divide and rule. Puts trade into the World Trade Organization, puts biodiversity into the Convention on Biodiversity, puts what's happening up in the atmosphere and how much past the ppm into climate treaty. But they're all connected. The Convention on Biological Diversity obliges every country to conserve biodiversity. That's an argument to any vested interest that says you cannot bring back biodiversity in your agricultural system. It's an obligation under the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's an obligation under the Convention on Climate Change to create climate resilience. More important, most important, there is no treaty on health, sadly. But I think every government, local, national level, has an obligation to protect the health of its people. And that is allowed in the WTO. The protection, stopping trade because it harms health, is built into the WTO treaty. And all the new work being done on diseases related to food needs to be invoked to say, this is why we are building local economy. This is why we're going to stop importing the junk food that is causing health, because we have a right and an obligation as a government. The issue of, yes, I mean the young people, the last song of the last farmer was related to that. And as I said, so far, the economics of punishing the farmer or the producer and rewarding the middleman and the trader has created a dysfunctionality in agricultural production. Similarly, a cultural assault has been made that farmers should disappear. The farmers should disappear. The cultural assault comes from a very false linear model of history. There was agriculture, then there was industry, then there's service societies. And I always ask my IT people, I said, so, you do servicing with software without eating? You know, food will always be necessary, and now we've realized the costs of bad food are too high. So not only is food necessary, good food is a fundamental right. Healthy, good food is a fundamental right. From there, we then have to have a cultural shift. And the cultural shift, back to the question I answered earlier, I said we must all be farmers in our hearts and in our minds, and with our hands. We could be farmers with 1 pot, we could be farmers with 1 square foot, we could be farmers with 20 square foot, or we could have actual farms. All of it, the logic is the same. Care for the earth and care for people and an identity with the earth. You talked about whether I would, between local, conventional and imported organic, what would I choose? The other lesson from quantum theory I learned is there's no either or in the world. There's no mutually excluded middle, which is so much part of Western thought. In India, we've never thought in terms of an excluded middle. It's always and. And the and that I would promote, and we promote through Navdanya, it's my practice, is local and organic. Regional and organic. Because that's where real economies get built, living economies get built. So we don't have to create false dichotomies and divide ourselves against each other and have the organic market movement fighting the sovereignty movement. No. The organic movement must be the food sovereignty movement, must be a women's movement, must be a children's movement, must be the ecology movement, must be the health movement, must be the democracy movement. It's all one movement.
I'm sure that there are still many questions, but we are limited with the time. And so give a big applause to Dr. Vandana Shiva.